Welcome, everyone, to our latest episode of the Don Quixote project. Today we are covering chapter 5 of part 1 of Don Quixote. And before we begin, or rather as our beginning, Judah, do you feel comfortable in providing us a synopsis on what happens in this chapter?
So I think this chapter is basically about Don Quixote's return home.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a return that isn't one that's willing, but is needed. So when we last saw him, he was spread out on the ground and beaten. And basically, he was quite fortunate because one of his neighbors from his town saw him. And after realizing who he was, then took Don Quixote to return him home.
Yeah,
And on his return home, then we see sort of the reaction of everyone who's present, who's been worried about Don Quixote, because it's clear that they weren't aware of where he went for the last few days. So it's just sort of a reaction of them interrogating Don Quixote, but he's quite like hurt still. So he just doesn't really engage so much with them and just needs rest. And then that's where the chapter closes.
yeah, exactly. It's one of the less eventful chapters. But there are lots of interesting reasons why. So this is kind of the end of a narrative arc. We've seen, if it's a good time to revisit what we've looked at so far. So we have the first chapter in which he conceives of the idea of becoming a modern, or rather early modern, chivalric knight. He then has his first sally, realizes and of course, his first sally comes after he's made his makeshift helmet and taken up the arms of some of his ancestors, gone out on Rocinante, his steed, and then he realizes that he hasn't been knighted correctly. So then we have the adventure in the inn. Then after the adventure in the inn, if I am correct, he then comes across. And after he's knighted at the inn, he then comes across Andres, the boy who's being beaten for probably, we think, stealing some of the livestock of the man he's working for. And then, of course, he comes across the merchants traveling down to Sevilla and gets beaten by them after his request for them to recognize Dulcinea del Tobosa as the most beautiful lady of the land. Now, that's kind of the end of this first part. And there was a prominent Spanish philologist, Ramon Menendez Pidal, or it might have been Marcelino Menendez Pelayo. I forget exactly which one it was, but one of them theorized that actually Cervantes intended to end Don Quixote in this here. This was actually a potential end of Don Quixote already. And in fact, if you look at some of the older versions, today we've got this tendency to split them between part 1 and part 2. And part 1 is about, I can't remember, 54 chapters long or so, and then part 2 is the longer part. And that's what we consider the official part 1 and part 2 of Don Quixote. But if you get earlier versions in Spanish, it's a bit more confusing because those earlier editions, or modern editions even, that try uh, maintain the structure of the earliest editions, they call this part 1. This is the end of part 1 of Don Quixote. And then there's like a part 2, a part 3, and a part 4. And all 4 of those parts fit into part 1 conventionally, right? So there's some indication that this might have been the end of Don Quixote originally. Of course, then that leads to the question: why did Cervantes decide to continue it? And I actually don't know why. I haven't found any arguments um, any arguments as to why he decided to continue. Uh, Tudor, this first part, I think maybe if we open up the very first component of this chapter, we've got Don Quixote lying on the ground. He's unable to get up. And then he says, and then he starts reciting these verses from, oh, I'm trying to remember which exactly, um,
Something with
which,
an M. I'm not quite sure.
yeah, I think in the Spanish they say the story of Baldovinos and the Marquess of Mantua. So
Yeah, Matt.
Baldovinos and the Marquis of Mantua. Um, and and then he I think so it's quite funny. So the Spanish here says uh, trújole su locura a la memoria aquel de Valdovinos y del Marqués de Mantua, cuando Carloto le dejó herido en la montaña. Historia sabida de los niños, no ignorado de los mozos, celebrada y aún creída de los viejos. Y con todo esto, no más verdadera que los milagros de Mahoma. So basically, what that's saying is it was, the story was known by children, not unknown by the young, by the youth, celebrated and even believed by the elderly, despite not being any more true, in the words of Cervantes, than the miracles of Muhammad. So the part here that's quite interesting is, of course, that Cervantes is referring to the idea that many people actually believe that this tale that Don Quixote is reciting is true, which then of course puts into context Don Quixote's madness. He's clearly not the only person who believes this is true. He's part of a substantial minority of people who believe it's true. There's also something interesting. So one of the things he shares with that group that believes that everything is that this is actually true is that he's also elderly, right? And I wonder why. I mean, I haven't actually thought too much about this, but I wonder why Cervantes makes this distinction. Uh, he says that it's known by the children, it's known by young people, but it's believed by the elderly. I don't know if what that really kind of refers to. I'm curious if any of you have any novel takes on that.
Interesting. I think when I read it, I think I associated it more so with this idea of like stories having like a history and
Mm,
place within like communities, and often like children will engage with it from a level of like learning.
okay.
So children like hear stories and it teaches them about like certain principles or morals about life. Adults know of these stories because they've heard of them before, but their priorities are with other things like contextually in terms of like working and things like that. And then specifically then with the elderly, as we see Don Quixote, it's people who have time, right, who aren't necessarily working, and then they see these stories which have like been propagated through time that they can reflect on even when they were young. And it's something then that they can like believe in um, and hold on to
Yeah.
because it's something that like grounds their experience within the community and within the greater space. I
Yeah.
think what's interesting specifically with this case is also because these are sort of the stories people like reflect on, specifically in times of like strife or struggling. And then this is the point where Don Quixote can't move. He's stuck on the ground. And he says, "Oh, I know a story where this is like a similar situation. And I'm going to begin reciting it, because this is what I know in this context of what's going on."
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my take.
Interesting. Yeah, of course, it sort of provides him with the strength to keep going, and he can kind of associate his experience with some narrative that he's read beforehand, and in some sense, kind of have a participatory relationship with it. Yeah, I think that is valid. That's an important point here. Kia, I don't know if you have anything to say about this segment, or maybe the part that immediately follows, which is the when the villager comes across Don Quixote. Any comments there? I don't know if you can talk yet. So okay, you can now.
Yeah, I
Perfect.
can talk. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I think there is like this distinction. I can't really think about like why. Like I think age generally is important. Because it isn't common for a hero to be as old as he is. And I guess it does feel self-referential in that way that he's like all these other characters that he interacts with do know the stories. And there is like a sense that a lot of them respect the stories. Um, but but he believes the stories and he's kind of the oldest character. So there's like a sense in which that he's talking about himself and legitimizing himself, that it's not only him who believes the stories to this extent that all old people do. So I mean that was one theory. It was like kind of a justification for his own madness. Um, but yeah, I wouldn't think that that was all it is. Yeah, as for like the next section, um, I think I'm just like kind of struck by how nice he is to him by comparison to everyone
Pedro
else.
Alonso, yeah. Pedro Alonso is very,
Yeah.
yes. There's a Roberto González Echevarría, of course, mentions that this is a Good Samaritan motif, right? Siglo de Oro Spanish literature was full of these, sometimes not particularly well hidden, but also sometimes quite subtle biblical motifs that are incorporated into the
Mm,
narrative. This is one of those examples, clearly. But I
mm,
think also it's a commentary as well on class, right? So just to orient everyone who's watching, Pedro Alonso is this villager who comes across Don Quixote. As Tudor says, he comes to recognize that he's Don Quixote after he lifts the what's the word in English?
I
After he
do.
lifts the visor, yeah, after he lifts the visor, he
mm,
recognizes this is Don Quixote, or in his words, Señor Quijano, right? Because he knows him as Señor
yeah.
Quijano, not Don Quixote. And then and then of course he's very caring for him. González Echeverría points out that he's so concerned with Alonso Quijano's well-being that he even waits for the sun to go down so that no one
Mm,
sees him in this state. So there's a sensitivity from Pedro Alonso's part for Don Quixote's social position, something that Don Quixote clearly doesn't actually have, right? He's clearly not at all afraid to appear as a fool, but Pedro Alonso is aware that someone of his class would not want to come across as a fool. So, look, class is always an important thing in literature of any time, but in the context that we're talking about, Spain is modernizing. We've spoken about this before, and all the dynamics of modernity that come with that. And one of the questions that's posed repeatedly in Spanish literature at the time is this distinction between nobleza de sangre, nobility of blood, and nobleza del alma, nobility of soul. And maybe we could start by examining this by looking at the further into the context. So, as the Spanish state was modernizing, but also because the process by which the Spanish state modernized was also the process of what's termed by historians a reconquista, which is this very like general catch-all phrase for the conquering of territories that used to belong to the Visigothic kingdom by the Spanish, the Christian kingdoms in the north. And we've referred to this. This is important kind of background medieval history. One of the things that happened is that you could earn, if you were part of those northern Christian kingdoms, you could earn a degree of social prestige by defending a frontier territory, and you could then become incorporated into the ranks of the nobility. So there's this
mm,
distinction between the people who had hereditary nobility and then people who increasingly were earning their place in the ranks of the aristocracy by by their works. A corollary to this, of course, is that this, as happened in most monarchies in late medieval and early modern Europe, the Spanish monarchy tried to assert its authority by reducing the power of the nobles, right? And so you have this sometimes this conflict between the nobility and the monarchy. And one of the ways that the Spanish crown wherever it be, whether it be the crown of Castile or the crown of Aragon. One of the ways that it could resolve this conflict is by introducing newer members of the nobility who owed their allegiance to the crown directly because they were being rewarded for their efforts during war. This is now happening, and so there's this idea. I mean, to talk of meritocracy back then is as complex as talking about meritocracy in any time in history, right? It can only ever be a limited meritocracy, but you could argue that what's happening in the bureaucracy of modernizing Spain is there's this kind of newer meritocracy to being noble, and so there's this idea that you express nobility by virtue, and that's actually what makes you a noble person, even if you don't end up being officially a noble, right? So I think we might be seeing an example of this. Someone who is essentially, I think you might refer to him as a villano. Let me see quickly. Labrador, a laborer. Yes, nothing to do with the dog. I think the word for the dog, Labrador, is related to the Spanish word for worker, but it's a very circuitous etymology for the dog. But this man is a laborer, right? Yet he shows virtue. Yeah, so that's kind of that's quite a lot of context there that I wanted to place this in. I think there's a good chance that Cervantes is working within this established trope of nobility of soul from people who are not nobles by blood. Sancho Panza comes to embody this as well later. Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Yes.
Sorry, there was a gap. Please continue.
No, continue. I was asking precisely if there were any comments from your side.
No, I think what you're saying is it does seem like very reflected in that scene where he's like, he gets addressed as a nobleman and then he denies that he is a nobleman, but then the actions underneath does indicate this like the soul that's like eligible to nobility, right? So yeah, it was just like yes, I agree.
and what I like about that is, of course, it returns to this question: is Don Quixote's madness revealing a reality that's beyond the appearances, that underlies appearances? So in calling Pedro Alonso a noble, is he actually seeing something that isn't immediately apparent, but is true?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it is interesting as well because there's like, I feel like in this chapter, I mean, it's always been there, but like, I don't know, for whatever reason, this chapter, it feels like a lot more there that there's like a blurring of reality where sometimes he's the characters in the story and the relationships he has are actually with those characters, and sometimes he's himself when he's like talking about his own prowess and whatever. So it's like, okay, but are you Don Quixote or are you this other person? But yeah, actually thinking about it, it kind of plays into identity as well, because when he first meets the peasant, whose name I've suddenly forgotten, or Pedro, when he first meets him, he says, oh yeah, I don't know how you pronounced it. I think the English guy calls him Quixada or something. You said it very differently.
Yeah,
that's like his actual name.
Señor
And then
Quijana, yeah.
Quijana,
yeah.
Like with an N, not with a D.
Well, he's actually, I mean, it's there's Quesada. He could be. There are multiple surnames there are multiple putative surnames that Don Quixote really has. One of them is Señor Quijana, and I think that's what Pedro Alonso calls him. He says, Señor Quijana, who has placed you in this state? It's put you in this state, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting translation. But I guess then there's this assertion that he knows who he is afterwards, and like that reassertion of identity. I think I lost my point with the mind-floodedness about how to pronounce the thing.
No,
Sorry.
apologies. Maybe I shouldn't have jumped in there. But you point out something interesting that struck me here, and I completely ignored it the first time I read Don Quixote. But a little bit later, when he's being treated in his house, if you pardon the jumping ahead a little bit, it says somewhere that they examined his body and couldn't find any injuries.
Bruce. Yeah,
Mm.
they just had a few bruises, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So if you look here, so the Spanish says, luego a la cama y catándole las feridas, no le hallaron ninguna. There's this, there's this, I mean, maybe this had a different meaning at the time, but this word here, ferida, which is the origin of the current contemporary Spanish herida, just means wound or injury, wound really. And so they say they did not find any wounds. And yeah, that's sort of strange, but it's very clear that he can't get up. So I don't know what's going on here. Maybe Tudor, you read that a bit more carefully than I did.
I also thought it was interesting. I think like it feeds into that thing of like the blurred lines with like Don Quixote's experience, um, and also of like how other people are perceiving the reality of the situation.
Yeah,
Um, I think it also now that you highlighted this idea of, because I also glanced over it, but this idea of waiting for it to be night, so that his ego wouldn't be like bruised or
yeah,
like hurt in a way. Um, it's sort of now I think as well of like Don Quixote, the chivalric knight, is wounded and hurt after this engagement, but the the person behind it isn't, right? So I think it's interesting. Yeah.
yeah. That's actually a good idea.
Yeah.
Is in a sense, I never thought of making that distinction. So Don Quixote, qua Don Quixote, is actually physically wounded, as far as an idea can be physically wounded. But
Yeah.
Alonso Quijano is actually not bearing any physical wounds, and maybe this is an indication that he'd kind of given up. Like he was by being beaten down by merely these merchants. It was the sign that like he was a failure as a knight, and he just didn't want to continue. Um, his return
Mm.
home, of course, this closing of the narrative arc is a complete failure. Okay, yes, he's kind of been knighted as far as he can tell, but he hasn't succeeded in anything. There's even
Mm.
this implication in the one intervention for justice for Andres that he's kind of aware that Andres is about to be beaten to a pulp. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
Mm.
so throughout this, he's actually completely failed. Like he's had no successes so far, save for receiving the knighthood that he wanted, and and maybe he's kind of glad for the opportunity to return home and
Mm.
And
rethink
I
his.
think it's interesting because then also he doesn't engage with the people that are home, that are waiting for him, right? That are very like real and present in
Interesting.
like Alonso's life, right? He
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily like attribute, I would say, like characters that he needs to tell tales to and create a narrative through which he can engage with them. I think he does a bit in a
Hmm.
sense of like saying he needs to recover, but it isn't, I would say, to the extent of the previous chapters.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely true because of course he doesn't. It says here that when to all the questions they asked him, he just answered, "I need food and drink." He doesn't kind of elaborate anything on anything further than that. So that's of course important.
Mm.
That seems very important. I don't know if you have anything to say there, Kia.
Um, I mean, I don't know if this would have been a part of the idea of writing, but I think there was like a group of people, I mean, not everyone treated mad people well, but there was like a group at some point, and I'm referencing nothing because I can't remember where it's from. But the treatment for madness was just like rest.
Yes.
And I think he keeps asking for food and rest. And like I don't know, I guess like maybe there's a sense that he's trying to cure his madness to some extent, maybe. But that's a bit far-fetched. Well, that I guess it just relates further to like what the cure is. And like there's a sense of ailment and like they're wanting to kind of even though they don't see any actual injuries, and he insists that he's bruised, but there's no confirmation of him actually being bruised. There is like this reaction from everyone around him that it's really convenient that he thinks he's injured because he might not be physically injured, but he's psychologically injured and they need to cure it somehow, whether that be spiritually or just like keep him in one place so that he doesn't do anything more
Yes.
bizarre and crazy.
Good point. I like that point. What, of course, because what that indicates is, of course, the remedy, right? So we see towards the very close of the chapter, and maybe this is also perhaps evidence that Cervantes didn't really want to end the book here, because the end of the chapter has got this reference, or rather, why did I say reference? But it's more, there's this indication that the priest, the cura, the barber, and I think there was someone else as well, they want to kind of cut this problem at its root. They want to address the problem at its root.
The housekeeper, I think.
The housekeeper, thank you, yes. They want to address the problem at the root by, in some sense, inhibiting his access to his books. And that, of course, is the topic of the next chapter, which we will turn to soon. The next chapter, of course, is very interesting because there's a lot of historical context that we can look into. This is the time of the printing revolution, and of course, and if I may be slightly controversial, censorship is actually a natural part of every society. I think our desires not to have censorship, which are very, I think, understandable, but they're widespread in 21st century and really also 20th century political action, I think ignore the fact that censorship has been the norm throughout history. It's only really an Enlightenment idea that we should be fully free of censorship, and even then, one could argue that there were unseen forms of censorship that would have characterized in Enlightenment capitals and the educated circles in the Enlightenment after the Enlightenment. I'm maybe jumping outside a little bit of the context of this chapter, though, because I'm merely talking about the censorship of his books the priest and the barber are going to conduct in the next chapter. I'm not sure that there's much more we can comment on here. It's a fairly simple chapter. It brings to the end an important first arc. It's Don Quixote's failure, and we see how he recovers from this failure to go back out into the world again and reinvents himself to some extent. Of course, the principal reinvention of Don Quixote is that now he realizes he needs a squire, right? And so the next arc is the arc in which Sancho is introduced. Are there any comments before we finish? Am I maybe being a bit premature in calling this discussion to an end?
I think for me, the one thing that maybe stood out that we didn't quite touch on was this idea of, and I think they engage with it in the next chapter, of the root of the madness. So I think I'm not quite sure, but I think in the English they refer more to like the niece, of saying like these things were going on with him, but we just figured he was like acting a bit strange, but it was sort of because of these books, right? Because of this reading that he was engaging with, that he's become mad. And I think it's interesting because I think for me, maybe it's not the most evident thing, but I think often when people engage with madness within a society, sometimes it can be attributed to a context of like a source of reading books, of certain beliefs that become present, and sometimes they can be attributed to the individual, right? So
Hmm.
I think when we engage with Don Quixote, I don't do it consciously, but like after this chapter, I realize how I view madness can fluctuate,
Yeah.
specifically with his actions. Of is
Mm.
there something he's doing because it's inherently part of his identity, or is it something that's rooted in a cause of some context of books of the adventure? Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Uh, Kia, do you want to say something there before I jump in?
Uh, if your thing is going to be directly related, then you should jump in. Mine's a bit tangential.
Okay. So what I'll then finish off with is, well, what I'll then answer, not finish off with, is yes. So this of course brings up this question through that runs throughout Don Quixote. Um, is Don Quixote mad because of the books he reads? Maybe a question that Cervantes is posing rhetorically is, does chivalric literature make you mad? Um, uh, the I think we can assume that he wouldn't answer simply no, or he wouldn't answer simply yes. Sorry, he wouldn't simply answer in the affirmative. But of course, there's parallels questions that we have today. Of course, do video games cause violence? Right. This is kind of like a question that's reached meme status these days, and yeah, that's an interesting question. How is what we consume? How does what we consume condition how we act? And I think we would be equally flawed if we were to assume that the what we consume causes bad habits, but we'd also be equally short-sighted if we said that there's no causal relation at all um, between the what we consume and what we do. And of course, Don Quixote is all
Mm.
about that relationship. So that's an important point that actually touches upon what you say. There might be another point that I wanted to make that's now slipped my mind. So I'd rather pass on to you, Kia.
Yeah, I guess we hadn't mentioned the niece that much. And I was just thinking about that. So you were talking about the root of the madness, and I was thinking about who's taking responsibility for his behavior. And so you could explain that as madness, but then he's like, he blames the horse for his failure.
Yeah,
And then uh, Sancho, I think not Sancho, Pedro does blame the madness, I think, but he then takes responsibility for him and then takes him. And then the niece takes responsibility for him becoming mad as well.
yeah,
And and then of course they blame the books particularly, and they blame the books in like such a they personify the books as heretics, and that's why they need to be burnt. So there's like an even grander sense of like, wow, these books are actually like bad in such like a moral sense that they need to be punished.
yes,
Um, like personally and sent directly to hell maybe. But I think there was just like this interesting relationship between I guess identity and autonomy, in that he's like gone out and as you say, he's failed. Um, but he's like gone out to make himself different. And I guess is it him to blame that he couldn't rise above um where he was when he started, or is it these other things to blame? And that does have a very interesting relationship with like what we consume. And then there's like that, I guess, like you say, this is a very, very old narrative. It's like Platonic. I think this is also like one of those links between Quixote and Plato, where it's like what kind of the immorality of art and how it can affect the soul in like a moral sense.
yeah,
So whether or not people have responsibility over what they do if they are exposed to certain media.
yeah.
And all the characters seem to be saying no, to some extent, it's everyone else's fault except Quixote's.
Precisely, and what we see here is we see Cervantes acting as a new Plato. So just though Plato, in proposition, condemns art in quite stark terms, or rather, let's put it this way: Socrates, the character, does, especially in the Republic. Um, Nonetheless, Plato's using fiction to convey his
And
arguments,
so is
and
Quixote.
yeah, and so is Cervantes, right? So Cervantes is putting this
Yeah,
criticism,
sorry.
this critique of literature, and or rather an exploration of what literature is in a literary language. So
Yeah.
so again, it's Platonic in the sense that it doesn't seek some kind of simple answer. It rather seeks to
Mm.
pose and sort of articulate all of the existing potential positions on a topic, and allow us to see how they naturally unfold and interact with one another.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, I think towards the what both of you have convinced me of is that I've been a little bit rash in not paying enough attention to the back end of this chapter. Any other questions or any other comments, observations that either of you want to make about something that happens in the latter part of chapter 5?
Uh, no, I think I'm good. I think I was just gonna add that sense of irony that you were talking about, and that like the characters are saying this, but then doing something else, and so is the author, and that's in
Yeah.
both Plato and
And
Quixote.
even when they do engage in burning the books, I mean, the point is that the priest and the barber are very knowledgeable about what's going on in the books themselves, right? So,
Yeah,
and what's
otherwise they wouldn't know whether or not to burn them.
And what's very funny about it is that they don't. I'm jumping a little bit into the top next class's topic, but the point is, when you look carefully, they don't condemn them for moral reasons. They actually, by and large, condemn them because they don't consider them literary works. So there is another irony there as well. Tudor,
Yeah.
anything on your side?
I think I didn't have much to add. I also enjoy the irony um, of the work, and I think it's a good setup for next week when you see all these people who attribute the books to blame, but also how they have beliefs and opinions about these books
Yeah.
that influence their way of thinking. And yeah,
Mm.
I also liked a lot Kia's description of personifying the books as
Yes.
heretics.
Yeah.
And also
Mm.
seeing sort of the literary device also seen as a voice, right? Of
Yeah.
Mm.
communicating some beliefs. So yeah, I think I'm good for this week.
Perfect. Yes,
Yeah.
the book takes on a life of its own, right? And becomes almost a
Mm.
person interacting in the world as any of us do. Okay, then if there are no other questions, I think what we will do is we'll bring this to a close. Once again, I thank you both very much for your time and your attention. I always enjoy discussing this book with you because I always find out so much more that I completely overlooked when I read it on my own. So thank you again, and we will see each other next time.
Well,
Awesome.
thank you so much.
It's a
Thank you.
pleasure.